Hey everybody, it's Bobby here. I hope you had a great holidays. I'm sorry this upload's a bit late. It's been over like a week since I've uploaded last. I got kind of busy and a little bit of laziness mixed in at the same time. Christmas was obviously a big thing, spending time with my family, so I didn't get really time to work on it. So when I had started working on this video, it was like Monday. And then I just was lazy, so it took me a couple of days to get, the script and everything written, instead of, I probably could have knocked it out in one day if I stopped being completely lazy, so that's on me. Today, we're going to get started with the Unsolved serial killings / mass murders, Iceberg. I'm just condensing it down a little bit into the ultimate Unsolved serial killings Iceberg. If you've never seen an Iceberg video before, an iceberg chart has entries that vary from the top or the tip of the iceberg being the most well-known, or maybe in this case least disturbing, of entries, and then the lowest of the low, typically down in the depths of the water, would be the most obscure or the most disturbing. Before we get started though, I'm gonna preface that a lot of these entries in the first two layers, maybe even the third one as well, are really well known, so there's no point in me kind of going over them again, because obviously it'll be things like the Zodiac Killer, which have had thousands of videos, there's movies about it, shit like that, so there's really no point in me covering it. But I don't also want to just not include any entries in a tier, so even the more well-known ones, I'm still gonna try to get some information out and at least try to keep it entertaining. I also am going to preface that I use the word violation as a kind of like a synonym for a different word that I'll put on screen that I don't think I can say on YouTube. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoy this video. My goal for this series is to ideally have at least one whole tier covered per video, but with these type of videos, different than my last videos because there's a lot more for me to cover in just one tier. There's a lot for me to talk about because I'd like to go through the cases, get through the victims and what happened, and the suspects as well. So it's a lot more meat compared to in the my original PSA or Nick one, where it's kind of just I'll put a little short summary of something and then I'll have like a visual, or I'll have literally just like a description of a video and then I'll show like a video for like the PSA Iceberg. But yeah, let's just dive right into it.
Печенюшки такая хрумкая. Это правильно тебе на. Нос холодный у него? Не как у собаки.
So starting us off in this video is JAT Flight 367. JAT Yugoslav Airlines Flight 367 was a McDonnell Douglas DC-932 aircraft that had exploded shortly after flying over NDB Hermsworth, East Germany. It was en route from Stockholm to Belgrade on January 26, 1972. The plane was piloted by Captain Ludwig Reisdre and First Officer Ratko Mihik. It broke into three pieces and spun out of control, crashing near the village of Srbska Kamenice in Czechoslovakia. Of the 28 people on board, 27 of those people were killed upon impact, and one crew member, Vesna Volvic, survived. She now holds the Guinness World Record for surviving the highest fall without a parachute at 10,160 meters, which is 33,330 feet, or 6.31 miles. The cause of the crash was reportedly a bomb that someone had placed in the baggage hold on the plane. Volvic believes that it was a man who was extremely annoyed coming off the plane when her crew was getting on the plane. Volvic and other crew members had noticed how, unhappy and annoyed this man was, but they didn't really say anything to him. It's thought that he had checked a bag that contained the bomb in Stockholm and then got off in Copenhagen but never reboarded the flight. Other Yugoslav authorities suspect that it could be Croatian nationalists that had already carried out 128 terror attacks against Yugoslavian civilians and military persons between 1962 and 1982. It's even said that a man who described himself as a Croatian nationalist had called the Swedish newspaper Kvällsposten the following day and claimed responsibility for the bombing, but there were no arrests ever made. Some people are skeptic, like the Guinness World Record representative, who said that it seemed like at the time Guinness was duped by the swindle just like the rest of the media. But in my opinion, I think no matter what happened, that's a fucking horrible way to look at it, because 27 people died. But in the end, Volvik's fall was proven that it was possible by Mythbusters, depending on how the wreckage someone was sitting in landed. And already our final entry for this first tier is the Long Island serial killer, also referred to as the LISK, or the Craigslist Ripper. The LISK is what I'm going to use when I talk about him. The LISK was believed to have murdered 10 to 16 people over a period of nearly 20 years and disposed of their dismembered bodies in areas on the south shore of Long Island, New York. Most of the known victims were sex workers who advertised on Craigslist. The killer was believed to have been a white male in his mid-20s to mid-40s who was very familiar with the south shore of Long Island and has access to burlap sacks, with potential ties to law enforcement, which helped him avoid detection. His victims' remains were discovered over a period of months in 2010 to 2011, after Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old sex worker, had disappeared in Ocean Parkway area after a 911 call saying a client of hers tried to kill her, resulting in police searching an area along Ocean Parkway near the remote beach towns of Gilgo and Oak Beach in Suffolk County. A cadaver dog that was initially searching for Gilbert was alerted to a scent through thick vegetation and a light layer of snow, discovering a skeleton in a disintegrating burlap sack. The remains were identified as Melissa Bartholomew's. Police then continued their search, discovering 3 more bodies. The 4 found were referred to as the Gilgo 4. 4 bodies all found within a quarter mile of each other on Gilgo Beach in December 2010. Then, 6 more sets of remains were found in March and April of 2011 in Suffolk and Nassau counties. Police believe that the 6 found in 2011 predate the bodies found in 2010. Gilbert's remains were found a year after the remains of the Gilgo 4 were discovered. Her cause of death was contested. Police try to say that she passed away from accidental drowning, while an independent autopsy determined that there was possible strangulation involved. So they've named a few suspects since the discovery of the bodies. We're going to go through them now. So John Bittroff was a carpenter from Manorville, Long Island. He was suspected in at least one of the LISK murders and was convicted of murdering 2 sex workers in 1993 and 1994. Joseph Brewer, another man, an Oak Beach resident, who was reportedly one of the last people to have seen Shannon Gilbert alive after he had hired her as an escort on Craigslist on the night of her disappearance. Brewer had said that after Gilbert arrived, she was acting erratically and fled his home. Gilbert was seen reportedly running through Oak Beach, pounding on doors of homes in Brewer's neighborhood, and then calling the police saying that they were trying to kill her. But the police had found no evidence of him doing any wrongdoings, and then he was cleared as a suspect. James Burke was the police chief, but he was also suspected in this case due to his blocking of an FBI probe of the LISK case during his time as the police chief. In November of 2016, Burke was even sentenced to 46 months in federal prison for conspiracy. Burke had violently assaulted a man in custody who had stolen a duffel bag from his police vehicle. The duffel bag contained adult toys, a DVD featuring explicit content, and Viagra. Burke had pleaded guilty in 2016 to charges of civil rights violations and conspiracy to obstruct justice. In December of 2016, an attorney for Gilbert's family reported that an escort had suspected that Burke may be connected to the LISK cases. The escort, who had called herself Leanne, stated that one night at a party she had attended in April of 2011, she had seen Burke drag a woman of Asian appearance to the ground. Leanne then said she saw Burke at another party in August of the same year, where she decided to engage in sexual activity with him, where Burke was very violent, and he was unable to finish his job. Then he threw $300 to $400 at her afterward, which she said was her first time being paid for sex. Peter Hackett was an Oak Beach resident and neighbor of Joseph Brewer. He phoned Shannon Gilbert's mother, Mary Gilbert. Mary had recounted that he had said that she was taking care of Gilbert and he had ran a home for wayward girls. 3 days later, he called Mary again, denying that he had ever contacted her previously or had made any contact with her daughter. investigators were able to confirm that Hackett had called Mary twice following her daughter's disappearance, and Gilbert's remains had been found near Hackett's backyard, with some of the personal items being found just directly behind his property in a marsh. Gilbert's family had filed a lawsuit against Hackett, saying that he had took Gilbert in, facilitated her death by administering drugs to her, but the case was dismissed because it just couldn't be proven. Later, the police had revealed that Hackett had a history of exaggerating his role in major events, so then he was just ruled out as a suspect in general. Our last suspect in the case is James Bissett, who is a businessman who took his own life in his car at Matatuck Park. One of Bissett's business was a plant nursery, which was the main supplier of burlap in the region, which was found very suspicious because many of the victims were found in burlap bags. I think out of the suspects we have, I would say Hackett is probably the biggest suspect. James Burke is pretty odd for what he does, but I don't think he was the killer. I think he was just a dickhead. I have no idea. But in the end, it was never concluded who the LISK actually was, and the most recent updates of this case are the release of evidence to the public and the identification of one of the Jane Does as Valerie Mack, who also went by Melissa Taylor. So now we can get into the second tier. These cases are also pretty well known, but hey, maybe you haven't heard about some of these. Maybe I just know a lot or something like that. I don't know. The Doodler, also known as the Black Doodler, was a serial killer who was responsible for up to 16 murders and 3 assaults in San Francisco, California, between 1974 and September of 1975. All of his victims were white males, and it's believed that they had all died after meeting the suspect near locations where their bodies were discovered. The Doodler was a man between 19 and 25 of African descent. He was roughly 6 foot tall with a slender build. While thought to have killed 16 people, only 5 bodies were recovered. Gerald Kavanaugh was a Canadian-American immigrant who was believed to have been his first victim. He was 49 when he was stabbed to death. His fully clothed body was found on January 24, 1974, lying face up on Ocean Beach in San Francisco, California, on the early hours of the morning. It's believed that he was conscious when he was murdered, and he had tried to resist the killer because he had defensive wounds on him. He was a single man, and there's very few details about his personal life. Another victim, Joseph Stevens, known by the nickname J.E., or just J, I don't know why I put it like that, was discovered on June 25th of 1974 by a woman walking along Spreckles Lake in San Francisco. He was 27, and he had died shortly before his body was found. He had been seen at the club the previous day. Officers suspect he was alive at the time he had been at Spreckles Lake, possibly transporting himself and the killer to that area. Klaus Christmann was a German-American immigrant who was discovered by a woman walking her dog on July 7, 1974. He was found similarly to Gerald Kavanaugh at the Ocean Beach in San Francisco. His death was more violent than the previous murders, though, because he had more stab wounds than Stevens and had been slashed in the throat several times. Unlike the other victims, Christmann was a married man with children, and the things that he had on him suggest that he was a closeted gay man. Frederick Kappen was a 32-year-old man who was discovered on the 12th of May, 1975, in San Francisco. He had been stabbed like many of the other victims. It's believed that he was dragged 20 feet as there was disturbances in the nearby sand. Kappen was identified through fingerprints that were matched to those taken by the state due to his occupation as a nurse. He had also served in the U.S. Navy, earning medals in the Vietnam War. The final victim that was found is Harold Goldberg, a 66-year-old Swedish-American immigrant discovered on June 4, 1975, in a decomposed state, roughly 2 weeks after his death in Lincoln Park. He was slightly inconsistent compared to some of the other victims, because he was far older than the others, and unlike in the other cases, his underwear had been taken by the killer and his pants were unzipped. Goldberg was believed to have been the last victim of the Doodler. Police investigation had actually found a young man as a murder suspect, but were unable to proceed with charges because the 3 surviving victims didn't want to out themselves by testifying against him in court. Among the victims were a well-known entertainer and a diplomat. The suspect had cooperated with police, but he had never admitted guilt for the murders and attacks. The officers strongly believed that the man they had apprehended was responsible for the crimes, but he was just unable to be convicted or tried because the victims refused to appear in court. To this day, the suspect was never named, publicly, or even apprehended. Two other suspects had arisen in 1977 after a pair of men in Rondo Beach were arrested in Riverside County, and questions on suspicions of approximately 28 murders that had occurred similarly to the San Francisco killings. The most recent updates in this case come in 2018 and 2019. In 2018, recent success of using DNA technology had allowed police to re-examine evidence that was in the case. And in 2019, police had offered an $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the killer, along with a revised sketch of how he may look 4 decades later. But to this day, it remains unsolved. Well, outside of the man that probably did it, but got away because no one testified against him. The Freeway Phantom. The Freeway Phantom was a media epithet for a serial killer who was active in Washington, D.C. from April of 1971 to September of 1972. He had had 6 victims, all of which being female teenagers or children. His first victim was Carol Denise Spinks. She was a 13-year-old girl from southeast Washington who was going to buy groceries at a 7-Eleven that was a half a mile away from her home. On her way home from the store, Spinks was abducted. Her body was found 6 days later at 2:46 p.m. behind St. Elizabeth's Hospital in a grassy embankment next to the northbound lanes of I-295, about 1,500 feet south of Suitland Parkway. Examination revealed that she was essayed and physically assaulted and strangled. She was found dressed but missing her shoes. Darlena Denise Johnson was a 16-year-old girl from Congress Heights who was abducted while she was going to her summer job at Oxon Hill Recreation Center. One witness had reported seeing her in a black car driven by an African-American male shortly after her abduction. 11 days later, her body was found 15 feet from where Spinks had been found. An anonymous caller had given details about the location of the body, but had also had details that only her killer and the detectives would have known. By the time they had come across her body, it was far too decomposed to determine the cause of death, or if she was essayed. But eventually, police were able to find evidence of strangulation. Brenda Faye Crockett was a 10-year-old girl from Northeast Washington who had failed to return home after her mother sent her to the store. Jesus Christ, I cannot believe that dog's fucking barking. Sorry about that. About 2 hours later, the Crockett's home phone rang, and it was answered by her 7-year-old sister, who was sitting at home while the parents had searched the neighborhood. Crockett was on the other line crying, and she had said, "A white man picked me up and I'm heading home in a cab." Crockett told her that she believed she was in Virginia before abruptly saying goodbye and hanging up. A short time later, the phone rang again and was answered by the boyfriend of Crockett's mother. She had repeated what she had said in the last call, adding, "Did my mother see me?" and saying that she was alone in a house with a white male. The boyfriend asked her to have the man come to the phone, and heavy footsteps were heard before Crockett says, "I'll see you," and hung up. Authorities assumed that she was at the killer's home, but by 5:50 the next day, a hitchhiker had discovered Crockett's shoeless body on U.S. Route 50. She had been violated and strangled. A scarf was knotted around her neck. Nemo Shea Yates was a 12-year-old girl who was walking home around 7 p.m. from a Safeway store in Northeast Washington when she was kidnapped, violated, and strangled. Her body was found within 3 hours of her abduction, just off the shoulder of Pennsylvania Avenue in Prince George's County, Maryland. As with the other killing, she was shoeless, and even though a witness had apparently seen her get into a blue Volkswagen, that lead had gone nowhere. Brenda Denise Woodard, after having dinner with a high school classmate, Woodard, an 18-year-old girl from Baltimore City, had boarded a bus back to her Maryland Avenue home. 6 hours later, a police officer had discovered her body, which had multiple stab wounds and had been strangled, in a grassy area near Prince George's County Hospital. Unlike the other victims, she was wearing her shoes, and a coat had been placed over her chest. In the pockets, there was a note from the killer. Here's the note. "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Freeway Phantom. Based on this handwriting sample, the authorities had summarized that the note was probably written by Woodard, and due to the lack of duress in her writing, she might have known her kidnapper. The final victim, Diane Denise Williams, was murdered nearly a year after the other victims. She was a 17-year-old senior from Baloo High School who was visiting her boyfriend after cooking for her family. She had been spotted boarding a bus at 11:20 near his house, but a few hours later, her strangled body was discovered dumped along I-295. As with other victims, her shoes were missing, but there were no signs of SA. To this day, the Freeway Phantom case had been open and closed multiple times, but currently stands as an open cold case with a $150,000 reward for any information leading to the arrest of the Phantom. There's a few suspects in this case, so let's start off with the Green Vega gang. Members of this gang had been responsible for numerous Washington, D.C. and surrounding Maryland vicinity violations and abductions that had occurred near Washington Beltway. Logical investigation and intimate knowledge of the modus operandi of the Green Vega gang had brought them to the forefront, where they were individually interviewed by homicide detectives. One of the members initially implicated that another gang member who had said he was involved with one of the homicides, and he had been able to share information that only the detectives and the perpetrator would have been able to know, but was also able to give a verifiable alibi that it showed he hadn't committed the murders. But after a public official had announced a break in the case and provided the fact that it was an inmate at Lorton Prison had given the information, the man had stopped talking and declined further interviews, along with denying that he had ever given information in the first place. Edward Sullivan and Tommy Simmons were two ex-cops that were arrested for the murder of Angelina Denise Barnes, who was believed to have been a victim of the serial killings, but later authorities were able to rule that out. The last suspect, and the strongest one in my opinion, is Robert Askins, a 58-year-old computer technician. In 1977, he was charged with abducting and violating a 24-year-old woman in his home in Washington, D.C. When investigated, Detective Lloyd Davis learns that Askin had already been charged with murder on several previous occasions. Going back in time, in 1938, when Askins was 19, he had served cyanide-laced whiskey to 5 sex workers at a brothel, resulting in the death of 31-year-old Ruth McDonald. Only 2 days after that incident, he had stabbed another sex worker to death, 26-year-old Elizabeth Johnson, who was at the same brothel. Upon his arrest, Askin declared to police that he was a quote-unquote woman hater and was placed under mental observation. While there, he broke free of his restraints and assaulted 3 orderlies with a chair before being subdued. During his trial, it was revealed that he actually was a police informant that was aiding law enforcement in the arresting of sex workers. In 1939, Askins was found criminally insane and committed to St. Elizabeth's Hospital. 5 months after his release in 1952, Askins would strangle 42-year-old Laura Cook to death. He was then indicted for his murder in 1954 and accused of several other assaults, along with being retried for his murder in 1938. It was then determined that he was sane upon committing all of his kills. Despite claiming he had intended the cyanide for himself, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 years to life. But his conviction was somehow overturned in 1958. But after his 1978 violation charge, Askin's home was searched by police in connection with the Freeway Phantom murders. Court documents had been found in a desk drawer where a judge had used the word tantamount, which was a very uncommon word. It had appeared in the note that was also written by the killer of Brenda Woodward. Furthermore, colleagues at the National Science Foundation, where Askin had been employed, reported that tantamount was a word frequently cropped up in his speeches. Eventually, a search warrant was obtained, and investigators dug through Askin's backyard, but there was no physical evidence that was in his backyard or any bodies like that. He was not charged in connection with the Freeway Phantom killings. Eventually, Askins had died at the Federal Correctional Institute in Cumberland, Maryland, at the age of 91. To this day, or I guess to his death, he had denied being involved in the Freeway Phantom killings. even adding that he wouldn't have the depravity of mind required to commit any of the crimes. I'm going to be real. I think he was the most suspicious suspect out of all of them, other than obviously the dude in the green Vega that had admitted to it, or kind of admitted to it, or at least said he knew a guy who had done it. My big thing is that the Askins shows how, like, some shit in in our judicial system is just kind of fucked up. Like, there's no reason a man like that should get away with killing multiple people, and he only gets caught like fucking 50 years after he does it. It's unbelievable to me. Our final case for this episode is the Keddie cabin murders. This is a pretty slim case. The Keddie murders were an unsolved quadruple murder that happened in 1981 in Keddie, California. The victims were Glenna Susan Sharp, daughter Tina Louise Sharp, and son John Stephen Sharp, along with John's friend Dana Hall Wingate. The murders had occurred in House 28 of the Keddie Resort. The bodies of Sue, John, and Dana were found on the morning of April 12th by Sue's 14-year-old daughter Sheila, who had slept over at a friend's house. Sue's two younger sons, Rick and Greg, as well as their friend Justin Smart, were also in the home, but they were unharmed. Tina was missing from the scene, though, and Tina would remain missing until April of 1984, until her skull and other bones were discovered at Camp 18 in California, near Feather Falls and Butte County. Multiple leads and suspects were examined in the years following, but there were no charges ever filed, and with several new leads in the 21st century, even a hammer in a pond found in 2016, and multiple announcements regarding the discovery of new DNA evidence, there was no suspects listed to the case, and it remained unsolved to this day. So I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. I'm sorry I kind of stuttered here and there. This is a little bit different than some of my other PSA videos, or even the shorter videos that I've made in the past for these type of cases. It's kind of hard to keep it efficient, and I tried to do, unlike in a lot of the other videos, I would split it up, recordings between talk about. So from like each victim, I would split that into separate audio files, but the problem with doing that is it makes it a lot more difficult to edit. So I just decided that I would try to kind of one take everything and see how that goes. If it's really not good, I won't do that again. But I think it's pretty fine. I know that this isn't probably as many entries as you guys hoped. It's really not as many as I had hoped, and I'm trying to get more efficient with it as I go. So hopefully the further we get into the depths, we can try to extend to get as many cases as possible in each tier. It's just kind of hard because I would like to keep the video like a pretty moderate length, but a lot of these cases have a lot of information to them, and I also want to get to a lot of the meat in the cases without having to cut kind of stuff out. So worst case scenario, I have videos that are slightly longer, or I just maybe split up each segment of the iceberg into multiple parts in order to get as in-depth as I can. But for now, hopefully I'll see you soon in the next video. I'm gonna try to make my next shortened video. Maybe I can just I'll go through some of the cases that I don't get a chance to touch on in the video, or in these videos. But yeah, I'll see you guys all later. I love you. Thank you for all the support. It fucking means the world to me.